Okay, we are recording. I'm Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College. And today I'm joined by Krista Thomason, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Swarthmore College in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. She's also currently the Philip L. Quinn Fellow at the National Humanities Center in Durham, North Carolina. Krista, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so you are the first person I've had on the show, this series, that doesn't work in aesthetics.
I'm going to ruin everything.
I know. I mean, you could be the last if this goes poorly. But you work in ethics, you work in moral psychology, and in particular, you work on sort of the dark side of our moral lives. Your book from 2018 is Naked, The Dark Side of Shame and Moral Life from Oxford University Press. As you know, I love that book.
So do I, as it turns out.
Yeah, I would. Yeah. This would be like a real moment if you were like, it's not
nah.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of my own stuff. But we're talking about the dark side of our aesthetic lives today. Previously, I've spoken with Hannah Kim about true crime, basically, and we'll get to there. But I want your take on sort of the dark side of our aesthetic lives as it intersects with the dark side of our moral lives. And so in particular, in aesthetics, when talking about immoral art and how we should respond to it, there are generally three main views, and it's unclear where some people fall along these lines. So I'm not going to mention any people who advocate for them, especially since people's views sort of slightly change over time. But the three big views are moralism, which is that moral defects in a work of art, so artworks that get us to sympathize with immoral characters or propound immoral worldviews, those are also artistic or aesthetic defects, right? Those works of art are worse as works of art as a result of advancing or getting us to sympathize with, immoral characters or immoral worldviews. Then there's amoralism, which is the view that the aesthetic and the moral just entirely come apart, right? That we don't judge works of art artistically or aesthetically in terms of their moral flaws or defects or their positive morality, right? A work is not better because it's moral, or a work is not worse because it's immoral in some way. And then the final view is immoralism, which is, I think, a relatively modest view, which is that sometimes a work of art is better artistically because it gets us to sympathize with an immoral character, or it gets us to sort of buy in for a bit to an immoral worldview. And so those are the three main views of moralism, amoralism, and immoralism. And so you, as someone who works in moral philosophy, what's your take on this sort of general terrain that I've mapped out in aesthetics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I probably, although this is, not a view that I've worked out anywhere. So I think I probably lean more toward the either amoralism or the immoralism sort of view. So I think there are different standards by which we judge the, works of art versus, whatever the kind of moral aspect of those things are. I think there are definitely artworks of various kinds that are made aesthetically better because they do something immoral under some broad description. They get you to sympathize with something. They get you to see something that's otherwise kind of morally dubious in a different light. And it seems to me like that could really be an aesthetic achievement. The hard question, I think, for me is there are these cases where you might have a film or a book or something like that presents the characters in such a way that you are so either morally disgusted or kind of horrified by the content, such that you don't have a way of interacting with the work of art. Like something about those emotions or that reaction kind of gets in the way of you interacting with the work of art. So I'm trying to think of a good example. Like, there's I can't remember the name of the book, but Philip Roth is like, I'm sure he's very great, but like, I haven't read a ton of his books, but the few that I have read, the way he portrays his female characters, right? I can't quite get past the way that they come across. They come across as like totally flat or just perfectly objectified or something along those lines. And there are other works of art where they have questionable female characters that I don't have that reaction to, but this one I happen to. So I find myself unable to explore the work aesthetically because I feel as though that kind of response, this sort of disgust response that I have toward the way these women are portrayed, kind of blocks me from having any kind of further engagement with the work. Now, what I don't want to say is that that is a kind of attitude that I want to prescribe. Like, that's not something I want to say. You should feel that way about this particular work of art. And that's where I think people start to go from, at least the sort of moral side. There's a way that people want to take your kind of moral obligations, moral responsibilities, and moral ways of seeing the world and colonize kind of every aspect of your life into everything has to be judged by moral standards of various kinds. And that's not something that I want to do when it comes to art. That's not something that I necessarily want to do in a lot of ways, because I'm kind of deeply sympathetic to a kind of, Susan Wolf, Bernard Williams kind of view about human life being very broad and our moral questions being one section of that life, but it's not the entirety of that life. And so I think aesthetics is a place where this really, that you can see that being brought out really clearly, where look, there's this whole way of interacting with objects in the world that are just not, it's really not captured particularly well by only seeing it through this kind of relatively narrow moral lens.
Yeah, and so I mean, just a couple examples that I'm thinking of, right? And so the ending of Titus Andronicus by Shakespeare, right? That's about as morally abhorrent as you can get, and it's something that in real life I would be utterly and completely appalled and disgusted by, and I would condemn. Yet in the fiction, I want it to end that way. I think that's how it should end. It's my favorite Shakespeare play.
Yes.
It's my favorite one to teach. And it's because the ending is so wild and perfect, right? I mean, he, with Chiron and Demetrius, right? Tamara's two sons, he has them chained up. He tells them step by step what he's going to do to them twice, right? I'm going to slit your throats. Lavinia is going to collect your blood. I'm going to chop up your bodies, grind your bones to dust, mix the bone dust with the blood, and make a dough and cook your heads inside that dough, right? Cook the meat from your faces inside that dough. Then I'm going to feed it to your mom. And then he fucking does it, right? And it's perfect. And yet clearly it's deeply immoral. And yet it's an achievement of the play that I sympathize with this character and feel like within the play, this is the only way justice can be served. And that pun is, I think, intentional in Shakespeare. Yeah. So that's one example. Another example is I love the Death Wish movies, right? Charles Bronson killing punks. And, the worldview, that those films advance is deeply right-wing in a way that borders on fascist, right? And yet I entirely sympathize with the character. I thoroughly enjoy these movies, and yet the moral worldview that they're advancing is one that I entirely disagree with. I don't think anyone in real life ought to be doing the sorts of things that Charles Bronson's character was doing. So I don't know, do you have either thoughts about those examples or examples of your own that you want to bring up?
As you well know, I love revenge. And so like, of course, like Titus Andronicus is like the perfect example of that. Yeah, I mean, this is So for me, in my own work, thinking about negative emotions, right, I think some of what is driving our concerns about particularly things like revenge films, I think we tend to sort of go, oh yeah, revenge films, they're really satisfying. And then we stop there. So then, and then we don't try to kind of say a little bit more about why they might be satisfying or sort of what's going on with that. And I think we have a tendency to retreat, although this is not, necessarily the wrong view, but I think we have a tendency to sort of retreat to a like vaguely Aristotelian position on this. So we sort of go, well, look, it's fine to kind of have those feelings and experience all that stuff within the context of fiction, because vague Aristotle words about catharsis and blah, 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 right? There's a sort of like, a sort of hand wavy explanation of it's fine to experience it when it's fantasy land, but it's not fine to experience it when it's real life. So, right. So if Titus Andronicus was a real story, we would be horrified and disgusted, but because it's a Shakespeare play, we feel okay about that. So it's not that I think that intuition is necessarily wrong, but I do want to kind of press the point that having taking pleasure in sort of feelings of or fantasies of revenge, even when they are outside of the context of fiction, is necessarily a bad thing. Right. So part of my whole shtick is kind of pressing people to not be so afraid of their negative emotions and to think that they're these like monsters that are chained up inside of us. And so if we let them loose, oh God, what are they going to do? I think there's a lot of reasons to reject that position, that's actually not how we should relate to our negative emotions, that these feelings are ubiquitous. People feel them all the time. You feel them for a while, they eventually go away. There's not really anything to be afraid of in experiencing the full range of emotions in human emotional life. So even though I think, yeah, it's totally satisfying in Titus's, it's not just that it's satisfying, it is that the revenge that is played out in the play is aesthetically masterful. Like, it is masterful. It is, dare I say, beautiful, right? It is awe-inspiring. That whole, everything about it is perfection. Everything about it is perfection. So not only is it deeply aesthetically satisfying and creates this amazing aesthetic experience, I think it is also fine for us to sort of feel the rush of the vengeful feelings that are part of that aesthetic experience, not just because they're part of that aesthetic experience, but that it's okay to feel those feelings more generally. And so we don't necessarily need to we don't need to sort of say they're only okay in this kind of context. I think it's okay to feel them in other contexts as well.
Yeah. So it's a question of the having the feelings versus the acting on the feelings, right?
Right.
It's okay to sort of have revenge fantasies,
right?
But acting on them is an entirely
a
different question. Yeah, but I mean, I like your point about Titus. I feel like the beauty of the ending is absolutely enhanced by the abject horror and disgust elicited in it, right? That if that were defanged in some way, in the way that I'm sure like Victorian productions of Titus Andronicus, the ending was probably much cleaner in the way that the Victorian productions of Romeo and Juliet, they live happily ever after, right?
Poor Victorians. We're very like the Victorians in so many ways these days.
But the sort of morally sanitized version of Titus Andronicus is a less beautiful, less aesthetically valuable work of art. And it's precisely because it sort of primes those pumps of vengeance that we ourselves feel regularly. And, as you're saying, that we shouldn't necessarily feel bad about having those feelings or attempt to repress them in ourselves, but it, allows us to sort of vent them for a while, and maybe in an Aristotelian sort of cathartic sort of way. But yeah, I mean, further, I feel like the fact that we enjoy it sort of evinces our commitment to justice in general, right? Because the way that justice is doled out, in the way that it's measured and very carefully by Titus, I feel, Yeah, it's sort of, we're committed to justice. It's just, in real life, it's not this sort of justice that we're okay with, but it's, something better. I don't know. I'm rambling now. And anyway, what are you thinking?
Let me actually, let me object slightly to that, actually. So instead of borrowing from Aristotle on this point, I'm actually going to borrow from Audre Lorde. So Lorde has this great essay on the uses of anger. Everybody cites it, and it's fantastic and great. But you get, I think, a deeper understanding of what is going on in that essay if you pair it with, she's got this great interview with Adrienne Rich, which is also in A Sister Outsider, right? And so in that interview, she and Rich kind of disagree quite a bit about different things. But one of the things they disagree about is sort of Lorde's commitment to a way of knowing that is deeply intuitive and emotional. And Rich kind of wants her to articulate more of what she's talking about in regular old words rather than just sort of like relying on like images and metaphor, right? And so they come to like, they're friends, and so they're not, like fighting with each other, but they disagree about this one point, right? And so in that essay, Lorde actually describes kind of being in familiarity with and exploring your kind of a darkness in you, right? And she describes that in a variety of different ways. She talks about it in terms of anger, but she talks about it also in terms of like thinking about sort of imagining like what you're capable of, thinking more deeply about all of the kind of twisted like distortions that are inside of you. And she wants to say that it's important to explore that aspect of your life for a lot of reasons, but one of them is just a kind of an ability to be comfortable with the range of human experience, right? The complexity of human life. And we do ourselves a disservice, and we make human psychological life very flat and very one-sided if we don't kind of fully embrace and accept and actually explore the darker sides of our psychology and ourselves. So I know it's really popular, especially in moral philosophy, for people to take feelings of revenge and say, those things are representative of our commitment to justice. They are, we don't act on them, but they're, but the emotions themselves, they're really about this like morally righteous, high-minded thing. So like, don't be too scared of them. Like they're okay. Like they put the white hat on them instead of the black hat and they're all good. Right. And so I actually think that's not the direction I really want to go in. Even though, I think our commitment to justice is certainly comprised of emotional experiences. Yes, that's definitely true. But why can't it be the case that our emotional life is just a representation of the complexity of living a human life in all of that range, where, some of those experiences have to do with sort of our moral commitments, but some of them just have to do with being a person in the world, a human in the world, right? And so that's one of the reasons I kind of like a more Lorde sort of position on this one, because she doesn't talk about it in terms of, these things are part of the anger essay definitely lends itself to that interpretation, the sort of, this is about my commitment to justice. But the interview she does with Rich is actually a little bit, it complicates that interpretation of that essay, which I like, because I like that she's talking more, and she's not really talking about like justice, her experiences of justice in that essay. She has this meditation on sort of, how she kind of started writing poetry and how some of it was just an attempt to capture this particular moment she was experiencing when she was walking in Mexico. And it's this kind of like, it's this, I had this sort of really large, complex human emotional experience, and I wanted to be able to capture it in words. And the only way I could do that was to write poetry. And so she talks in this way about having these really large, complicated, rich, and textured, emotionally valenced experiences as part of what it means to live a human life. Some of those things are aesthetically focused, like the beauty of the sunset in Mexico. Some of them are just emotionally focused. But she sort of says, I have this kind of like really rich and textured way of interacting with the world that I can't put words on all of the time. And so poetry is my way of like putting words on that. But part of what it means to try to experience that fully is to explore it, even when it registers to you as dark, as twisted, as distorted, to not be afraid of those parts of yourself.
Yeah, so you don't necessarily want to rehabilitate the sort of feelings of anger and desire for revenge as,
right.
No, they're just, they're good things. They're good. Yeah. They point toward justice. No. They kind of suck.
They do.
And it's kind of sucky about us, but part of being human is to be kind of sucky.
Yeah.
Yeah. I dig it.
Me too.
That seems totally right.
Yes.
But not a but sort of related to that, I mean, this isn't just about works of fiction, right? You can think about song lyrics, right, which can be fictional to a certain degree, but can also, just be, expressions of people's feelings or worldviews, et cetera. And I mean, you've got a Motorhead shirt on, and I know you're a metal fan, and a lot of heavy metal song lyrics are morally troubling, to say the least, or, in some versions of metal, they're white nationalist, they're misogynistic, they're advocated for all sorts of things that in our ordinary moral lives we object to. And yet, us good, decent, morally upstanding folk sometimes, if not often, enjoy listening to music that is expressive of morally troubling things. And so what are your thoughts on that as a metalhead?
As someone who routinely does this, yes.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of different things, and I, just kind of talking from my own experience. So I'm going to call them easy answers, but I think they sort of dodge a little bit some of the harder questions. So let's talk about black metal, right? Okay, definitely some white nationalist stuff. Definitely like the Norwegians are, they're quite literally like, let's burn down some churches, where we mean that. We actually mean that. Like, we're not just kidding. We just actually want to burn down some churches. So in my own particular experience with that music, it is almost never the case that I am listening. First of all, I often don't actually understand the words when I'm listening to it, because they're mostly growled, and they are growled with like a deep Scandinavian accent, and it's very hard for me to actually understand literally what the words are. So I am almost never listening to the words, except for the ones that I can sort of make out. So it could actually be in Norwegian, and I would still listen to the music. I'm listening to it sort of for the whole, and this is the thing obviously that makes me, a metalhead, is that the whole experience of the music is a kind of like all-encompassing, the only way I can describe it is it's an experience of power, right? And I love that. I love that it makes me feel powerful. It makes me feel like I can take on the world. I love that experience about it. And I love the musicianship, and, you get to this like particular incredible riff, and it gives like chills up your spine, and like that whole story, right? So that's great. So I'm not listening to it because of the particular words that are being said. I'm listening to it for the overall experience. And frankly, the words are actually quite low down on the list of things that I care about when you say, like, what do you like about this song, or what do you like about this band? So, okay, I mean, that's all true, but it does sort of sidestep the question about, well, okay, but they are actually like, hello, Cannibal Corpse is quite literally talking about dismembering people. Okay, so it's actually, you may not understand the lyrics, but that's what the lyrics are saying. So I think maybe the slightly more complicated answer is, this is probably where I think the kind of immoralist position, I think, kind of gets its hooks into people, is that the way you can experience a work of art, you can experience it in multiple and complex ways. And experiencing it in multiple and complex ways does not equate to endorsing what is being presented, right? So my favorite example, pop culture example, my favorite example of this is 24, the show with Kiefer Sutherland. I freaking loved that show, right? And everybody from, everybody I've talked to who are mainly philosophers, like the idea was like, oh my God, that's like propaganda for terror, war on terrorism, and et cetera. And it was like, that was the only thing you could have possibly gotten out of that show. And were there people who watched it for those reasons? I'm sure. But when I watched it, I remember very clearly seeing what I thought was being presented as like, this character is being put in positions where the like you could watch the degeneration of Jack Bauer over the series, right? And you saw him push his friends, his closest friends and allies away. And the ways that he, when he would sort of start to fly off the handle and start, hooking batteries up to people, and torturing them, you could watch that. That was a degeneration, right? And so I'm thinking to myself, well, yeah, there are ways you can sort of just unquestioningly digest it as, yeah, Jack Bauer gets the bad guys. Or you can look at it and say, well, yeah, Jack Bauer's getting the bad guys, but at what cost? There's a lot going. There's actually this like other element of the show that I felt like, and maybe I'm being too charitable and I'm like reading that stuff into it. I'm sure there are people who are listening to me and saying, oh, you're rationalizing, you're just an apologist for this. And I mean, okay, I'm just saying there are complex ways of interacting with the thing that don't just count as merely endorsing, even if that message turned out to be the case, even if they wanted 24 to be anti-terrorism propaganda or whatever, there are still complex ways of interacting with it. In the same way that I imagine people who study, fascist propaganda posters, let's say, can look at it not just as this is definitely promoting fascism, but also looking at the way the art is structured, the way it's composed on the poster, the way the images function to sort of call to, other kinds of earlier traditions. I mean, scholars, I think, do this kind of stuff all the time. As someone who, one of my hats is sort of working on moral atrocities and, mass human rights violations. Nobody ever thinks that sort of the scholars who are studying those things are endorsing those things, right? Even though they have to, by nature of what they're doing, interact with some very morally troubling material, none of which is fictional, all of which is real.
Yeah, and further, there's some extent to which they're probably enjoying working on that,
exactly.
Right? It's not just sort of a slog that, well, I'm a good Kantian. I, separate my feelings from morality. I have to do this for some reason, even though I hate doing it, right? It's, probably, no, I get something fulfilling out of this, and it's sort of emotionally valuable as much as it is intellectually valuable. Yeah. So you can't sort of separate those things out nicely. I mean, I'm sure for some people it's, well, I just got to do this, but right. I'm guessing the overwhelming majority of people that study those things are like, no, I enjoy studying this. There's something emotionally valuable here, and it's not just sort of I'm committed to justice, I'm making the world better. It's there's something cool and interesting here.
Exactly.
However morally messed up this thing is, there's something I'm getting out of it.
It's way too easy for people to kind of retreat into the, oh, well, I study this, purely from a commitment to justice, where, it's important to understand and know these things so that they never happen again, so that we can prevent them. All that stuff may be true, but you know what it's like to be a scholar. These things are compelling to you in a way that it's not so, I wouldn't call it like titillating, and I wouldn't call it voyeuristic, and I wouldn't call it, any of that stuff, but these things are compelling to you. They capture your attention in a way that is not completely emotionally negative. You are drawn, right? And so it's too easy to sort of retreat into this kind of, scholarly, hermetically sealed attitude. I just think that's false to the experience.
Yeah. And I mean, crossing the line would involve something like you have like Tiger Beat photos of like your favorite fascist dictators on your wall, right? Like that would be going too far, right?
Right, exactly.
Like you start like genuinely admiring these people and enjoying them in a way that's crossing the line. But most people, I'm assuming, don't go that far in their scholarly lives.
Right. Tiger Beat.
Yeah. Fascist Beat magazine.
Fascist Beat magazine.
Yeah. I mean, that'd be a nice magazine of fascists getting beaten up. I'd subscribe to that.
Totally different understanding of beat.
Yeah, exactly. But I think this segues actually into the thing I talked with Hannah Kim about in the previous episode about true crime, right? And sort of the explosion of documentaries and podcasts and Netflix series, docuseries, documenting real life atrocities, usually serial killers who kill women. And what are your feelings about that? Because, we're shifting from fiction where you could at least have that argument, well, it's fiction, it's separate from life. I can enjoy and indulge in my negative emotions there, but that's because it's sealed off from real life in some way. However troubling that argument is, right, or whatever problems there are. But when you're dealing with nonfiction, right, you can't make that sort of argument, right, unless you want to sort of aestheticize the thing and say, well, I am treating it just like I would a work of art. And that's sort of a problematic way of justifying this to yourself. And so what do you think about, the explosion of that genre over the last, 5 or so years?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as someone who's has like too much of an interest in Ted Bundy, more than I probably should, this kind of thing is on my mind. So I think Hannah, I watched the episode. So I think Hannah's right. There's a certain sense in which a lot of this stuff is presented like it's a detective story, right? It relies on, the true crime documentaries and the podcasts and all that stuff. It relies on the structures and stylistic points of a detective story. And mysteries are super popular, right? They're probably one of the most widely read genres for, people who, just the average reader. I think people really love mystery stories. So if you present this kind of real life thing as a mystery story, then I think obviously it's just going to be compelling, basically for exactly the same reasons as, a mystery story is compelling for a lot of people. I don't know if people get a different kind of enjoyment out of it by knowing that it's true. I actually don't know. Again, for the average consumer, for the average person listening to the average podcast, I don't know that their aesthetic experience is very different from if I was just reading a mystery story. I do think, again, from the previous conversation, I think you guys are right that there's a sense in which people like to play detective. But again, they like to play detective when they read a fictional mystery as well. So I think a lot of those things just share that same kind of element. If you wanted to make a distinction and you wanted to say, no, there's a different way in which we're fascinated, right? So I do think, especially serial killers, like that has long been an object of fascination for people forever, right? So people are just obsessed, with figuring this stuff out, or with, being drawn in by learning about the serial killer. There I want to say, okay, again, here's the easy answer. So like, why am I interested in Ted Bundy? The easy answer is, well, Krista, you're a moral philosopher. And so you're interested in, when people do wrong, which is true. I'm very interested in that, trying to understand that at a scholarly or philosophical level. And so here's like a real life example of somebody who did in fact do horrible, horrible things. If you could figure this guy out, then maybe you could have some sense, right? Make some sense of evil, essentially, right? Which is, for the moral philosophers, I think, such a huge and compelling, for lots of philosophers, huge and compelling question. Okay, sure. I mean, it's not that that's false, particularly in my case. It's certainly not false, because I do care about trying to understand, when people do awful things, what's happening inside their head when they do awful things. How are they explaining themselves to themselves, right? And Ted Bundy actually is a perfect case for that, because he talked so much about it. they have hours and hours of interviews with him talking about his crimes and him trying to explain in some ways what was going on in his head. Now, there's all sorts of questions to ask about the veracity of those interviews and exactly is what's going on. But if you really do care about trying to understand what's happening, how a serial killer explains himself to himself, then you do, somebody like Ted Bundy is going to be more attractive for those kinds of reasons, because look, lo and behold, he said all those very things. Okay, fair enough. But I also think there is just this way that people look at a serial killer and they say that is at the boundary of a human experience that makes sense in the world. That this is, we're bordering into, all the literature on monster and what it means to say somebody's a monster, right? The thing about the monster, at least, depending on who you read, like at least some understandings of what it is for somebody to be a monster is that they are just on the edge of human. You look at them and they occupy this they're almost like a hologram, right? A hologram sticker where you shift it one way and it looks like a person, but you shift it another way and it looks like a monster, it looks like something unhuman. And so because serial killers look like they're on the one hand, they look like humans, but on the other hand, they do these absolutely monstrous things. It's very hard, I think, for people to look away from that because you are so compelled by this thing that looks these two different ways, the uncanny and the human at the same time. And you want to try to reconcile and you want to try to make it make sense, and it refuses you. And so there's a way that you just can't look away from that because it's too compelling to try to kind of reconcile those two things together. So I think that's, if there's a difference in how people experience stuff about serial killers versus, your regular old murder mystery novel, my guess is that's kind of what's driving it.
Okay. So yeah, good. So I guess one question, and maybe this will be the last question. Do you think it's morally troubling at all for producers of, these serial killer documentaries and podcasts to present them with the trappings of a fictional genre, right? They're sort of sucking us in and again, sort of turning these real world awful events that traumatize real people and the victims' families, and they're still around. There are survivors who are still around. Do you think it's at all morally troubling that these things are being presented as mysteries or in sort of a mode of fiction, sort of the fictionalization of real world events? Do you think that's at all morally troubling, or can it be morally troubling?
I think it can be because I think there are ways that, and you could make that a more general, so it's not necessarily even just in this case, but you could think there's all sorts of ways that it's a bit, there's something troubling about making something awful and atrocious into a kind of aesthetic experience, right? To try to take what is actually, again, not thinking fiction, thinking real life, some real legitimate horrible. I mean, imagine I don't know, this is a fictionalized example, but imagine a horrific train crash or something. And imagine a photographer tries to take really artistically composed pictures of, the mangled train and bodies on the ground. You know what I mean? Imagine someone looking at it and saying, aha, look at the composition of this, photo. There's a way that is kind of refusing to interact with the tragedy or the atrocity on its own terms. There's a way of, it's a weird kind of twisting of reality, you might think. And that if something is truly a tragedy, you've got to always sort of keep in mind this is actually, you have to remember this is what this is. So, if I'm watching my Ted Bundy documentary or whatever, it would be, you got to be careful not to get sort of too lost in the detective elements of the story, and remember that this is an actual killer, an actual person who caused death and destruction and terror to real live human beings. So in a way, that's a kind of call for the viewer, the consumer, to make sure that you are kind of making sure that your head is in the right sort of space, that you, and that's a complicated thing to do, but then you know what, life sucks and then you die, so you have to do like hard stuff. Okay, sorry, nobody ever told you moral life or human life was going to be easy, so you have to do hard things. Also true for, I think, the folks who are creating the art, right? The people who are like trying to tell the story. It's real. I think it's easy, particularly for people who, you know, are in this business, who are directors, who are making these films, for example. I think it's very easy to get yourself lost in the aesthetic details or the narratives or the stylistic points or that kind of thing. And so I think it is important for those folks to remember the same thing, to keep that complicated, keep that complicated headspace and make sure that you're not doing too good of a job, I guess is the question, of like making this into something aesthetic and into something that's more like an artwork. All that is to say, like, I think it is kind of troubling, but how do we navigate that space, and what goes, what's too far and what's on the right side of the line? That's a really hard call to make.
Okay, so I think on that morally ambiguous note,
nice.
And aesthetically ambiguous note, we should wrap it up. So Krista, thank you so much. This was fun.
Thanks for having me.
Maybe it was morally troubling that it was fun.
It might have been. It might have been a little morally, but you know what? That's okay.
I'm okay with that.
I'm okay with it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.